That Sunday morning in Sydney, the air carried that specific, crisp chill, the kind that makes you want to sit on your terrace overlooking the harbor, nursing a cup of black coffee while the sunrise paints the cod song in shades of gold. I am Arthur Sterling. I am 71 years old, and for 30 years, I served as a chief compliance officer for a major investment firm in the city. My life was defined by precision, ethics, and an uncompromising eye for detail. I was sitting at the marble island in my kitchen in Mossman, tapping the screen of my tablet to settle my monthly utilities. The house was peaceful. It had been overwhelmingly silent since my beautiful wife, Diana, passed away, a void that no amount of wealth or time could ever truly fill. I opened my banking application, the bright blue light flickering against the dark timber of the kitchen. My eyes adjusted, waiting to see the figure that represented the culmination of Diana's legacy. The number staring back at me was not the $485,000 I had secured just a week prior. The balance read $0. For a man who spent 3 decades tracking offshore financial fraud, identifying shell companies, and dismantling sophisticated laundering rings, you would think a suddenly emptied bank account would trigger a massive cardiac event. You would expect me to drop the tablet, to grasp at my chest, to gasp for air. But panic is the enemy of a clear mind, and my mind has always been my sharpest tool. I did not gasp. I did not throw the device across the room. I simply sat there, staring into the digital void, my pulse as steady as a metronome. That $485,000 was never meant to be a retirement fund. It was the life insurance payout from Diana, the exact amount we had meticulously saved to lay the foundation for a youth shelter in her memory. Diana had been an orphan, navigating the cold, indifferent foster system until she aged out. Her final wish was to build a sanctuary for children who had no one. Every cent was destined for a defunct community center on the east side of town. And now, it was gone, evaporated into the ether. I set the tablet down on the marble, the click echoing in the hollow silence of the house. Before I could even begin to process the mechanical failure that led to this deficit, a heavy thud vibrated from the foyer. I stood up, smoothing my cardigan, and walked toward the hallway. My front door was wide open. 2 men in thick, steel-capped work boots and stained high-visibility vests were wrestling my antique mahogany console table, a piece Diana and I had purchased on our honeymoon in the Blue Mountains 40 years ago, out the front door. I stepped forward, raising a single hand. My voice was calm, carrying the undeniable weight of authority I once reserved for embezzling corporate executives. "Excuse me," I said. "What exactly do you think you're doing with my furniture?" The taller man stopped, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "Just doing our job, mate," he replied. "New owner wants the place cleared out by noon." New owner. I repeated the words slowly, letting them sink into the still air. I reached into my pocket for my house keys, but as I moved to slide the key into the deadbolt, I realized with a jolt of cold clarity, the lock had been changed. They had drilled it out and replaced it while I was sitting in my own kitchen, unaware that my entire life was being dismantled around me. The pieces were moving, and I was about to find out who was holding the strings. "I need to see your work order, right now," I demanded. My voice didn't waver. It held the cold, surgical precision I had perfected during years of cross-examining white-collar criminals. The younger mover, a lad barely out of his teens, looked sheepish. He reached for a crumpled piece of paper clipped to his clipboard and handed it over with a trembling hand. I unfolded the document. It was an expedited estate clearance order, stamped with the official insignia of a boutique law firm I vaguely recognized. But it was the bottom line that held my attention. On the authorization line was a signature I could have identified in a pitch-black room with my eyes closed. It was the hurried, loopy handwriting of my 32-year-old son, Julian, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle at Balmoral Beach, the boy I had bailed out of significant credit card debt after he tried to impress a girl in his 20s. He had authorized a crew of strangers to strip my home bare. I stood in my own hallway, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon polish and aged wood, a scent that had defined my life with Diana for 4 decades, knowing full well it might be the last time I smelled it. The movers watched me closely, their eyes darting between my stoic face and the open door, expecting the typical reaction of an elderly man losing his grip on reality. They expected tears, a frantic outburst, perhaps a desperate call to the local police to create a public scene. But, as I have maintained throughout my career, panic is a luxury one cannot afford when being robbed. In the world of high-stakes financial fraud, I have dismantled corporate thieves who hid millions across global shell companies. I know exactly how predators operate. I know their arrogance, their blind spots, and their insatiable need for swift victory. And the first rule of catching a thief is to let them think they have achieved the impossible. You let them grow comfortable. You let them celebrate. You let them believe they have outmaneuvered you entirely. "All right," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of resistance. I handed the paper back to the young man. "Just be incredibly careful with the legs on that table. The timber is very old and fragile. If you scratch the mahogany, the value of that piece alone will exceed your company's insurance policy." The movers exchanged a bewildered look, utterly confused by my lack of protest. They had clearly braced for a fight, but they shrugged and turned back to the task, carrying the table out to the idling truck in the driveway. I walked back into the kitchen, the house already echoing with the emptiness of their departure. It felt hollow, cold, and stripped of its soul. I picked up my tablet again, staring at that cruel, neon zero balance. I knew why this was happening. Julian was getting married in less than 48 hours. An extravagant, 6-figure wedding in the Hunter Valley to Sienna, a woman who looked at me as if I were a persistent stain on her designer heels. Julian had been complaining about money for months, desperately trying to keep pace with Sienna's insatiable desire for luxury. I had adamantly refused to fund their spectacle, insisting that Julian learn the fundamental value of financial responsibility. Apparently, this was his twisted version of taking the initiative. He hadn't just ignored my advice. He had decided to steal his late mother's legacy to pay for an open bar and a string quartet. I didn't feel a surge of sorrow. Instead, a cold, calculating clarity washed over me. Every fleeting emotion shut down, and the forensic auditor inside me woke up. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a hostile takeover, and I knew exactly how to void the contract. I stepped out the back door and stood in the garden Diana had cultivated with such devotion. The Sydney morning sun was beginning to climb, casting long, sharp shadows across the lawn, but I felt nothing but a glacial resolve. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I didn't call the police. The local authorities would simply see a domestic dispute, an old man and his son squabbling over an inheritance, and label it a civil matter. No, this situation required a much more precise weapon. I dialed the number of my oldest friend and legal counsel, Martin Rosenberg. "Martin," I said, the moment he answered. "Execute Plan B." Martin didn't ask questions. He didn't offer platitudes about family or urge me to calm down. He knew exactly what Plan B entailed. He had watched me dismantle ruthless corporate executives for 20 years. He knew that when I used that specific tone, the forensic auditor had fully taken the helm. He simply said, "Consider it done, Arthur," and ended the call. But a good investigator knows that circumstantial evidence is never enough to secure a conviction. I needed a confession. I needed the arrogance of the perpetrator captured in real time, untainted and raw. I pressed the record button on my encrypted application and dialed Julian's number. The phone rang 3 times. With each ring, I stared at the empty space in my living room where the antique table had sat only minutes before. I imagined the empty bank account, the stolen life insurance payout, and the years of planning for the Diana Sterling Foundation, all now being liquidated to fund a weekend of champagne and hollow social climbing. The line clicked open. A blast of heavy, thumping bass music immediately assaulted my ear, the unmistakable, obnoxious sound of a high-end pre-wedding party. I could hear the clinking of crystal flutes and the shrill, artificial laughter of people who had never worked a hard day in their lives. "Hello." Julian's voice was slightly slurred, loud and irritated. He was shouting over the music, clearly annoyed that an incoming call had dared to interrupt his celebration. "Julian," I said, my voice intentionally flat, devoid of any paternal warmth. "There are men in my house removing my furniture, and my primary bank account has been drained. Explain yourself." There was a sudden pause on the other end, followed by the muffled sound of him muttering to someone nearby. "Hold my drink, babe." It was Sienna. I could hear her sharp, inquisitive voice in the background, asking who was bothering him. "It's just the old man," Julian muttered back, his tone dismissing me like a minor inconvenience. The music faded slightly as he stepped into a quieter room. "Dad, listen to me carefully," he said, the slurring gone, replaced by a cold, condescending cadence, a tone he had undoubtedly practiced in the mirror to sound like a man of business. "My wedding is tomorrow. This is the most important weekend of my life. I've withdrawn the money, and I've sold the house." "You sold my house?" I asked, enunciating every syllable for the digital recorder. "And you stole nearly $500,000 of your mother's money." "It's not stealing, Dad," Julian sighed, the heavy, impatient sound of a man explaining basic math to a toddler. "You're 71. You're not thinking clearly anymore. After your stroke last year, your cognition has been slipping. Sienna and I talked about it. You don't need a massive, unmanageable property, and you certainly don't need hundreds of thousands sitting in a stagnant account. We're putting that capital to good use. We're building our future." The audacity of his words hung in the air, sickening and sharp. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he didn't even realize he was reciting a scripted confession. He thought he had outsmarted a fading old man. Little did he know, he had just walked into the center of a trap of his own making. "Your future," I repeated, my voice a whisper, letting the weight of his arrogance settle between us. "You were stealing the foundation money for your mother's youth shelter to pay for a string quartet and an open bar." "Oh, please, Dad." Julian scoffed, a harsh, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Mom is gone. A shelter isn't going to bring her back. You're living in the past. Sienna and I have actual lives to lead. We have a status to maintain. You're just going to throw that money away on some charity case. Anyway, consider this an early inheritance. I've saved you the trouble of managing an estate." I stood in the driveway, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The Sydney sun was beating down on my shoulders, but I felt only a profound, icy clarity. The betrayal was so complete, so clinical, that it transcended anger. It transformed into a mathematical equation. He was no longer my son. He was a hostile entity, a variable that needed to be balanced against the truth. "Where am I supposed to live, Julian?" I asked, playing the role of the helpless, confused victim with the precision of a stage actor. "That's not my problem anymore," Julian replied, his voice devoid of even a flicker of guilt. "Put yourself in an assisted living facility. The proceeds from whatever junk the movers manage to sell should cover your first few months. You'll be safer there, anyway, with professionals watching you. Good luck." The line went dead. A sharp, rhythmic dial tone echoed in my ear. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the screen. "Good luck." Those were his final words to the man who gave him life, to the man who worked 80-hour weeks to put him through university, to the man who loved his mother more than anything in this world. I looked down at the recording application on my tablet. The file was securely saved, 1 minute and 42 seconds of pure, unadulterated fraud, elder abuse, and moral bankruptcy. I walked back toward the house. The movers had finished loading the living room and were now heading upstairs toward the master bedroom. They were going to pack up Diana's clothes. They were going to clutch her jewelry box, stripping away the last physical traces of my life with her. Any normal person would have stopped them. Any normal father would have called the local constabulary and fought to get his home back immediately. But I knew that if I intervened now, I would only catch Julian in a minor domestic dispute. Sienna would hire a slick Sydney barrister. They would claim a misunderstanding regarding estate planning, and they would tie me up in civil court for years while they squandered Diana's money. I couldn't let them win, not today. I turned my back on the movers and walked down the driveway toward my sedan, parked quietly under the shade of a large oak tree. I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and closed myself inside the quiet cabin. The heavy thud of the door effectively muffled the sounds of my home being dismantled. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a matte black laptop. Julian always made fun of me for carrying it around. He thought I was just an old man clinging to outdated technology. He frequently bragged about his latest smartphone and his expensive tablets, assuming that because my hair was gray, I barely knew how to send an email. He didn't realize that the very banking applications he used on his fancy phone were built on security protocols I helped design back in the late 90s. I wasn't a tech-illiterate boomer fumbling with passwords. I was the architect of the walls he thought he had just breached. I powered on the machine and bypassed the standard operating system, booting directly into a secure, encrypted environment. I connected to a private mobile hotspot and routed my connection through 3 separate virtual private networks. If I was going to hunt down nearly $500,000, I wasn't going to leave a digital trail for anyone to follow. I was going to turn his early inheritance into his lifelong prison sentence. I opened my banking dashboard. The consumer-facing application on my tablet had displayed a simple, taunting zero balance, but I needed the raw data. I bypassed the user interface, diving deep into the detailed transaction logs, the guts of the system where digital footprints are etched in stone. The screen filled with lines of code, routing numbers, and timestamps. My eyes scanned the green text against the black background, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades hunting financial ghosts. There it was. An outgoing wire transfer executed at 8:14 yesterday morning. The exact amount was $485,000. I highlighted the receiving routing number. It wasn't a local transfer. Julian hadn't just moved the money into his own checking account down the street. He had used a third-party clearinghouse to bounce the funds before landing them in a newly established high-yield account. I ran the routing number through a specialized financial database I still maintained access to. The destination was a regional bank headquartered in Singapore. My primary account, the one holding Diana's life insurance, was based out of Sydney. I leaned back in my seat, letting out a slow, steady breath. Julian wasn't just a thief. He was remarkably ignorant of international banking regulations. By moving that amount of stolen money across national borders, he had instantly elevated a domestic dispute into a transnational crime. He had committed wire fraud. The AFP, the Australian Federal Police, and the International Cybercrime Divisions wouldn't treat this as a family disagreement. They would treat it as a major felony. I began compiling the digital evidence. I downloaded the wire transfer authorization forms, the timestamp logs, and the specific IP addresses used to initiate the transaction. With every click of my mouse, I was forging another nail for my son's coffin. I discovered that the transfer had been authorized using a digital signature, a scan of a legal document uploaded to the bank to bypass fraud alerts. I zoomed in on the pixelated image. It was a medical and financial power of attorney. My stomach tightened, but not from fear, from the sheer, clumsy audacity of it. I recognized the document immediately, but something was fundamentally wrong. Julian was using a temporary power of attorney I had signed last year during my recovery from that minor stroke. But that document had an expiration date, and I had legally revoked it the moment I was discharged from the hospital. I looked closer at the date on the scan. It had been crudely altered using image editing software. Julian had forged my legal documents to convince the bank he had the authority to drain my accounts. This was no longer just theft. This was aggravated identity theft, document forgery, and a breach of international financial law. He had built his house of cards on a foundation of federal offenses. I saved every single file into an encrypted folder and backed it up to a secure cloud server, then sent a secondary copy directly to Martin's private server. The evidence was now indestructible. Julian thought he had outmaneuvered a frail, confused old man who would simply surrender to his fate in a cheap nursing home. He had no idea he had just walked into a trap of his own making, a trap designed by the very person he thought he had discarded. I closed the laptop and placed it back into the glove compartment. I looked out the car window. The movers were securing the heavy ramp on the back of their truck. They had taken everything of value, and the house I had shared with Diana was now nothing more than an empty wooden shell. But the crushing weight of loss had vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of absolute resolve. I started the engine. The quiet hum of the motor filled the cabin. I adjusted my rearview mirror, took one last look at the property, and pulled away. Julian and Sienna were currently hosting an extravagant rehearsal dinner at a massive estate in the Hunter Valley. They were drinking expensive champagne, celebrating a future built entirely on stolen money. It was time for me to pay my respects to the happy couple. I drove my sedan to a long-term parking facility near Central Station and left it there. I didn't want my familiar car parked outside the venue, giving them any advanced warning. Instead, I requested a private car service, a quiet, professional driver who kept the radio volume low, which I appreciated. I needed the silence to focus on the performance I was about to deliver. The drive to the Hunter Valley took nearly 2 hours, but the time passed in a haze of calm, calculated preparation. We pulled up to a sprawling iron gate. The property was a modern glass-and-stone mansion that Julian and Sienna had rented for the weekend. It was the kind of exaggerated luxury that people without actual wealth love to show off. Impeccably manicured lawns, imported palm trees, and a fleet of sports cars lined up like trophies. The security guard checked my name against a guest list. Since the rehearsal dinner was already in full swing, he simply nodded and waved us through. I thanked the driver, stepped out, and straightened my casual khaki jacket. I wasn't dressed for a high society evening. I was wearing the same clothes I'd put on that morning to drink my coffee. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I walked up the wide stone steps toward the double doors, which were propped open to let the evening breeze flow through the house. The sound of live jazz drifted out, accompanied by the low, self-important hum of people who believe their social standing was the most important thing in the world. I stepped over the threshold into the grand foyer. The interior was blindingly white. White marble floors, white leather furniture, and massive modern art pieces. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of delicate appetizers and tall glasses of expensive, sparkling wine. I stood near the entryway, letting the sheer arrogance of the room wash over me. Every bite of caviar, every drop of that vintage wine, and every hour this mansion cost was paid for by the legacy Julian had stolen from his own mother. I scanned the room, and it didn't take long to find her. Sienna was holding court near a massive indoor waterfall feature. She was wearing a sleek, pearl-colored silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back to ensure the photographer captured her perfect angle. As she lowered her glass, her eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. The fake, practiced smile on her face vanished instantly. It was as if someone had physically struck her. She blinked twice, unable to comprehend how the pathetic old man they had evicted that morning was standing in the middle of her rehearsal dinner. Her eyes darted around, checking to see if any of her wealthy acquaintances had noticed my presence. Satisfied that no one was paying attention to the wrinkled man by the door, she abruptly excused herself, handed her drink to a passing waiter, and marched toward me. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble, a metronome counting down to an explosion. I stood my ground. I let my shoulders slump slightly and soften my expression. I needed her to see weakness, to feel superior, so she would make the mistake of underestimating me. She didn't stop until she was inches from my face, positioning her body to block me from the view of the main dining hall. Her perfume was suffocating. "What on earth are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "You weren't invited to this, Arthur." I looked around the room, pretending to be confused and slightly intimidated. "I just needed to speak with my son," I said, letting my voice tremble just a fraction. I went to the house, and there were men taking my things. "I have nowhere to go." Sienna grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging sharply into my skin. "Keep your voice down, you crazy old fool," she ordered, her eyes wide with furious panic. "Look at you. You look like a homeless person who wandered off the street. You're completely ruining my aesthetic. If you cause a scene and embarrass Julian in front of these people, I swear I'll make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life locked in a state-run facility." She leaned in closer, her tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You have zero power here. Leave right now, or I'll have security throw you onto the street. Before Sienna could summon the guards, a hand firmly gripped my shoulder. It was Julian. He smelled of expensive cologne and top-shelf scotch. Sienna is right, Dad, he said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. You shouldn't be here, but since you are, we need to settle this away from my guests. He didn't wait for a response. He dragged me down a long, dimly lit hallway, away from the jazz and the laughter, until we reached a private study, a heavy room with dark oak-paneled walls and bookshelves that looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade. Julian closed the heavy door, sealing us in a tomb-like silence. He leaned against his massive mahogany desk, crossing his arms with the cold calculation of a man managing a nuisance. What is this, Julian? I asked, allowing my voice to crack just enough to maintain the charade. Why are there men taking your mother's furniture? Why is my bank account empty? Julian sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if I were a particularly tedious headache. Dad, we talked about this, he lied with practiced ease. Do you really not remember? My heart hardened, but my exterior remained that of a vulnerable, aging father. Remember what? I stammered. I never agreed to sell my home. I never agreed to surrender your mother's foundation money. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and tossed a folded document onto the desk between us. I had to step in, he said, his tone shifting to mock sympathy. You aren't well, Dad. Ever since your stroke last year, your cognitive decline has been obvious to everyone. You forget things. You get confused. Leaving you alone in that house with access to that much capital was simply irresponsible. I'm your son. It's my job to protect you. I approached the desk, my hands trembling with deliberate theatrics as I picked up the paper. It was a copy of the forged medical and financial power of attorney. Holding the physical paper, feeling the weight of his betrayal, made the air in the room feel suffocating. I stared at the black ink. He was using the very illness he had ignored. The stroke I recovered from in complete isolation while he was holidaying in Bali, to declare me incompetent. It's all completely legal, Julian continued, watching me stare blankly at the page. You signed it yourself. The doctors agreed you needed supervision. I transferred the funds into a secure trust that I manage. The house was too much of a liability, so I liquidated it to cover your future care. You should be thanking me, not making a scene. Thanking you, I whispered, letting a single, well-timed tear roll down my cheek. Not from sadness, but from pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian misread it entirely. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had finally forced me to accept my pathetic, new reality. Yes, Dad, thanking me, he replied, patting my shoulder with a condescending rhythm. Now, I need you to leave. Go to a hotel. My assistant will book a room for the weekend. After the wedding, we'll look into a nice assisted living facility. You make friends. It'll be good for you. I kept my eyes glued to the forged date on the document. The numbers have been blatantly altered to make an expired temporary power of attorney appear permanent. He was so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own superior intellect, that he didn't realize the massive legal trap he had just confirmed by handing me this paper. I folded the document, slipped it into my pocket, and nodded weakly. I turned my back on the only son I had left, walking out of the study and preparing to dismantle his fragile empire from the ground up. As I reached for the door, the knob turned from the outside. Sienna stood in the threshold, blocking my exit, a cruel, predatory smile plastered across her face. The look of a hunter who believes the kill is already in the bag. Sienna stepped into the room, her presence like a chilling draft. She looked past me to Julian, who gave her a subtle nod of victory, confirming that the old man had been neutralized. She turned her gaze back to me, her eyes devoid of anything resembling human empathy. You really thought you could come here and make demands? She said, her voice dripping with venom. You're homeless, Arthur. You're staying on this weekend. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 note, and held it out with 2 fingers as if it were a piece of rotting garbage. She stepped into my personal space until I could smell the sickly sweet scent of her expensive perfume. then shoved the bill directly into the breast pocket of my jacket. She patted it twice, a demeaning, rhythmic gesture. "Take a taxi to a cheap motel," she whispered her tone relishing the cruelty. "Buy yourself a hot meal and go to sleep. And don't even think about showing your face at the venue tomorrow. You aren't needed. Don't you dare ruin my photos." I looked down at the green edge of the banknote protruding from my pocket, then raised my eyes to meet hers. I let my lower lip tremble, my shoulders dropping another inch. I reached up and placed my hand over the pocket, clutching the money as if it were a lifeline. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice thick with fake emotion. I bowed my head submissively, playing the broken victim one last time before slipping past her through the doorway, leaving her and Julian in their temporary fortress of stolen wealth. I walked down the long, opulent hallway and out into the cool night air. My posture began to change with every step I took away from the mansion. The pathetic, doddering old man vanished into the darkness, leaving only the cold, calculating forensic investigator in his place. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the $100 note, and stared at it under the dim glow of a garden lamp. She thought she had purchased my dignity with a single bill, but she had only succeeded in fueling the final stage of my resolve. I reached for my phone, my mind burning with absolute clarity. Julian's arrogance had blinded him, but he wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a useful idiot. He had used a forged document to authorize a massive wire transfer, and he had routed those funds from a bank in Sydney to a clearinghouse. The moment those digitized funds crossed that threshold, his crime escalated from local theft to international wire fraud, a severe criminal offense under Australian law. I stood by the iron gates, waiting for my ride, and felt a deep sense of peace. The digital trap was now fully armed and locked. I knew that Julian and Sienna thought they were playing a game of family politics, but they had fundamentally misunderstood their opponent. They believed they were dealing with a senile father who would eventually surrender. They had no idea they had triggered a federal investigation that would dismantle their entire existence. As my ride approached, I thought about the house. Julian told me he had liquidated it to cover my future care, but he was remarkably ignorant of the legal architecture I had built years ago. When Diana first received her diagnosis, I had engaged a specialized firm to establish an irrevocable blind trust. I transferred the actual legal title of the house, the investment accounts, and the architecture of the insurance payout directly into that trust. The moment I signed those papers 5 years ago, Arthur Sterling ceased to be the legal owner of that property. Julian couldn't legally sell a house that I didn't even own. He had stolen a beautifully orchestrated illusion. He had sold a worthless piece of paper to a buyer who was likely just as crooked as he was. And because the dummy account he used to receive his ill-gotten gains was tethered to the trust's high-security system, that money was now completely frozen. They were all trapped in a cage of their own making, and the lock was already set. The ride back to Sydney was a blur of neon lights and quiet, clinical planning. By the time the car pulled up to the high-rise office in the CBD, it was nearly midnight. The lobby was a cavern of polished granite and cold, recycled air, save for a single security guard stationed behind the marble counter. I bypassed the pleasantries, took the express elevator to the top floor, and stepped into Martin Rosenberg's office. Martin was waiting. He looked as though he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His tie was discarded, his sleeves rolled up, and his desk was buried under a fortress of printed transcripts. He looked up, his glasses perched precariously on his nose, and gestured to the chair across from him. "The cybercrime unit is already tracking the bounce back, Arthur," he said, his voice grave. "But we found something else, something that makes this situation exponentially more volatile." He pushed a file across the desk. It detailed the property transfer for the Mossman estate. The buyer, Apex Holdings, isn't just a shell company. It's a front. I ran a cross-reference through the land title office and tied the initial deposit to a private commercial lender located in an industrial park in Western Sydney. It's a front for a local loan sharking syndicate, the type that doesn't use civil litigation to settle debts. They use physical intimidation. My stomach tightened, but not from fear. It was the thrill of the hunt. So, Julian didn't just sell a fake deed to a stranger, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. He sold a forged title to violent criminals who expect a return on their investment. Precisely, Martin replied, his eyes dark with concern. Chad, Sienna's fitness trainer, is the registered agent for Apex. He clearly convinced his creditors that he could flip your property for double the price. If he defaults on this loan because the title is fraudulent, they won't go after the law. They'll go after him, and they'll go after anyone attached to the transaction. I leaned back, taking in the full scope of the architecture I had built. Julian and Sienna were not just facing federal indictment for wire fraud. They were now unknowingly indebted to a criminal enterprise that dealt in bones, not balance sheets. Julian thought he was walking away with $1 million payout to start a new life in Dubai. Instead, he was walking blindfolded into a minefield where the triggers were pulled by people with no concept of mercy. What do we do? Martin asked, his voice barely a whisper. If the AFP intercepts the accounts now, the syndicate will know the house is a fraud. They'll find Chad. They'll find Julian. We're talking about real danger, Arthur. No, I replied, my tone as steady as a heartbeat. We don't stop the wedding. We let it proceed exactly as planned. We let them stand there in their expensive suits, posing for the cameras, believing they have outsmarted the world. And then, at the precise height of their arrogance, we let the floor fall out from under them. I walked over to the window, looking out over the sleeping harbor. I thought about the house in Mossman, the physical manifestation of my life with Diana, the walls I had sanded until my fingers bled, the sanctuary I had protected for 40 years. My son had traded our history for a woman who was currently plotting his downfall. He had handed the keys of his own future to a man who would sell his life for a quick profit. Julian wants a wedding, I murmured. Then he shall have one, a wedding he will never, ever forget. I turned back to Martin, who was watching me with a mixture of fear and profound respect. I knew he was wondering if I had crossed a line, if the desire for justice had curdled into something darker. But he didn't understand the forensic mind. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply ensuring that the audit of my son's life was completed with absolute accuracy. The books had a balance. For the theft, for the forgery, and for the cold-blooded attempt to erase the memory of my wife, there was only one possible conclusion. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to ensure that their entire, superficial empire burned to the ground while the whole city watched. And the most beautiful part? They were going to provide the matches themselves. The following afternoon, the Hunter Valley estate was bathed in a deceptive, golden glow. Under the sprawling marquee, the air was heavy with the scent of thousands of imported white roses, a display of opulence that felt more like a burial than a celebration. 300 guests, the cream of Sydney's social elite, sat in rows of velvet chairs, hushed and expectant as the string quartet played an elegant, melancholic melody. It was the perfect stage for a deception. I stood at the back of the lawn, a sharp contrast to the sea of pastels and designer suits. My charcoal Tom Ford suit felt like armor. I kept my footsteps measured, avoiding the gravel, moving with the quiet purpose of a man walking into a courtroom to deliver a final verdict. The ceremony was reaching its climax. Julian stood at the altar, looking every bit the triumphant groom, holding Sienna's hands while the priest spoke of honesty and unconditional commitment. The sheer hypocrisy of the words was enough to make the air feel thick, almost unbreathable. I didn't stop to ask permission. I bypassed the rows of guests and walked directly to the technical table where the young sound engineer was monitoring the live feed. He looked up, bewildered by my sudden appearance, but before he could speak, I reached over and firmly pulled the main auxiliary power cable from the mixing board. The sudden pop of dead speakers echoed across the estate, followed by an abrupt, deafening silence. The quartet stopped mid-bar. The priest's microphone went dark. 300 heads turned in unison, their faces masks of confusion and irritation. I stepped into the center of the aisle and began to walk. The white runner crunched softly under my shoes. Every eye was on me now. Julian peered past the guests, his face initially clouded with confusion, but as I drew closer, the recognition hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face until he was a ghost of a man, his mouth slightly agape. He dropped Sienna's hands as if they were burning hot coals. I climbed the steps to the altar, my movements deliberate and calm. I moved past the frozen priest and the terrified singer, reaching out to take the heavy microphone from its stand. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I held the mic close to my lips and let the stillness do the work. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a surgeon's blade. It was amplified across the entire estate, reaching the back of the tent where the guests sat in stunned paralysis. "You told me yesterday that I was a confused, forgetful old man. You told me you were taking control of my assets to protect me." Julian stumbled backward, his legs giving way until he was trembling on the edge of the platform. Sienna tried to step forward, her mask of composure fracturing into pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at me, then at the silent crowd, and finally at Julian, who was looking at her with a dawning, horrific realization. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I plugged the auxiliary cable from my phone directly into the venue sound system. My hands were perfectly steady as I selected the high-definition audio file from my encrypted folder. I hit play. The voice that boomed across the Hunter Valley wasn't mine. It was Sienna's, sharp and cruel, captured perfectly in my living room 3 days ago. I can't believe Julian actually bought the whole story. Once the wedding is over and the ink is dry on that wire transfer, we're going to disappear, and Julian is going to be left standing at the altar with absolutely nothing. The recording continued, with Chad's laughter and Sienna's wicked confession of betrayal. The guests didn't gasp. They were too horrified to breathe. I watched the revelation strike Julian. His world didn't just collapse, it vaporized. He turned to Sienna, the woman he had betrayed his own blood for, and saw the truth written in her panicked, hollow eyes. The golden future was nothing but a graveyard of lies. And as the final confession echoed off the marquee, I knew the trap had finally snapped shut. The atmosphere on the altar was no longer that of a wedding. It was a crime scene of the soul. Julian stood paralyzed, the audio recording looping in his mind like a death knell. He looked at Sienna, whose composure had completely disintegrated. Her face, once groomed to perfection, was now a map of frantic, desperate denials. She reached for him, her hands clawing at his tuxedo lapels, but he recoiled, his movements jerky and disjointed. The realization of his own foolishness, the debt, the fraud, and the woman who had used him as a sacrificial lamb, seemed to physically crush him. Down in the third row, Chad, the elite fitness coach, finally understood that the walls were closing in. He didn't wait for an invitation. He surged from his seat, pushing past startled guests in a clumsy attempt to reach the rear exit of the marquee. He was a man running from a ghost, but he was also running from a debt that knew no borders. I didn't need to move. The trap had already done its work. The silence was suddenly obliterated by the rhythmic, aggressive scream of sirens. They didn't approach with the cautious delay of local patrol cars. They tore into the estate like a military strike. 3 black, unmarked SUVs smashed through the decorative wooden fencing, the heavy tires churning the pristine lawn into a muddy mess. The vehicles swerved around the seated guests and skidded to a violent halt at the base of the altar. Doors flew open in unison. A dozen federal agents, clad in tactical vests marked AFP in bold, yellow lettering, poured onto the grass. This was a surgical operation, a coordinated federal raid. The lead agent, a woman with a face as stoic as stone, pointed a gloved hand directly at the platform. "Nobody moves," she commanded, her voice cutting through the remaining sirens like a blade. "Secure the perimeter. Identify the primary targets." 2 agents sprinted up the stairs of the altar. Julian didn't even attempt to resist. He was a shell of a man, his spirit utterly extinguished by the public unraveling of his life. As the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists, he looked at me one last time. There was no defiance left, only a hollow, pathetic plea for a salvation that I couldn't and wouldn't provide. The agent recited his charges: federal wire fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy. He was led away, his expensive tuxedo coat dragging in the dust of his own making. Down in the grass, Chad's escape was short-lived. He had barely cleared the velvet chairs when two agents intercepted him. He didn't go quietly. He thrashed and shouted, his elite physique no match for the disciplined force of a federal tactical team. They drove him face-first into the mud, pinning his arms behind his back. He screamed something about a mistake, about a misunderstanding with his investors, but the agents didn't care. They were there for the fraud, but they were also there to ensure he didn't disappear before his creditors could find him. Brooke, or Sienna, as she truly was, collapsed. She fell to her knees at my feet, the white silk of her designer gown instantly stained by the damp earth of the altar. She clawed at my trouser legs, her makeup running in dark, jagged streaks. "Arthur, please," she sobbed, her voice a shrill, hysterical whine. "Tell them it was Chad. He forced me. He manipulated me. I love Julian. You have to save me, please." I looked down at her, this parasite who had sat in my living room, drinking my vintage scotch and planning the final destruction of my family. I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt only a profound, freezing disgust. I reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my suit, ensuring there was no residue of her desperation left on my clothes. I stepped back, creating a distance that felt like a continent. "You made your choices, Sienna," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet audible over the chaos of the arrests. "You orchestrated a theft, you mocked a stroke victim, and you built a life on a foundation of professional-grade deceit. You are the architect of your own ruin." I reached into my pocket, pulled out the $100 note she had shoved into my chest the night before, and let it flutter down into her lap. "You should take a taxi," I said coldly. "Your aesthetic is quite ruined." As they dragged her away, her shrieks echoing across the lake, I stood perfectly still, the calm eye of a hurricane that had finally wiped the landscape clean. 6 months have passed since that spectacular afternoon. The crisp, golden light of an Australian autumn now settles over Mossman, bringing with it a quiet peace I haven't felt in years. I'm sitting on the front porch of my home. The same residence that was stripped bare by careless movers is now completely restored. Every piece of antique furniture, every painting, and every memory has been returned to its rightful place. The mahogany console table sits exactly where Diana and I placed it 40 years ago, its polished surface gleaming under the morning sun, a testament to the fact that some foundations simply cannot be broken by the greed of others. I hold a steaming cup of black coffee, watching the light filter through the leaves of the large oak tree in the front yard. The house is quiet, but it no longer feels hollow. It feels secure. The storm that ripped through my life has finally passed, leaving behind a sky of perfect, unrelenting clarity. The justice system moved with surgical speed once the digital evidence was presented. Julian didn't even attempt to fight the charges. When faced with the undeniable audio recordings, the forged power of attorney, and the paper trail leading directly to the shell company, his legal counsel advised him to take a plea deal. My son, the boy who thought he was a financial genius, is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a correctional facility. He writes to me occasionally. The envelopes arrive, stamped with the stark, bureaucratic seal of the prison system. I read them, but I do not reply. They are full of desperate, hollow apologies, the regrets of a man who is sorry he was caught, rather than a man who understands the gravity of his choices. He complains about the concrete walls and the loss of his lifestyle, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he traded his humanity for a temporary seat at a table that never existed. Sienna didn't fare much better. She tried to spin a false narrative of victimhood, claiming she was a pawn in Chad's larger criminal syndicate, but the federal prosecutors weren't interested in her tearful performances. She is currently facing trial for conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The wealthy friend she spent years cultivating abandoned her the exact moment the handcuffs appeared. In Sydney's social circles, a federal indictment is the ultimate social death sentence. She now lives in a cramped apartment, working a retail job just to pay her mounting legal fees, a bitter, daily reminder of the life she destroyed out of sheer, unadulterated vanity. As for Chad, his fate was decided outside the courtroom. When the federal government seized the fraudulent holding account, the syndicate's $600,000 investment vanished into a federal vault. The loan sharks didn't care about bureaucratic freezes or title disputes. They only cared that their money was gone. Chad vanished 3 days after the arrest, leaving behind his luxury cars and his failing business. He is now a man living in the shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that he bought himself a permanent, waking nightmare. A sleek black car pulls into my driveway. Martin steps out, carrying a pristine leather briefcase. He walks up the steps and hands me a stack of formal documents. "Good morning, Arthur," he says with a genuine, weary smile. "Today is the day." I set my coffee aside and pick up the heavy silver pen. These papers represent the culmination of my promise to Diana. The court not only restored the stolen $485,000 to my account, but also released the seized funds as restitution for the damages inflicted upon my estate. With a few deliberate, firm strokes, I signed the final charters. The Diana Sterling Foundation is officially funded. Next week, we will cut the red ribbon and open the doors to a sanctuary for children who have nowhere else to go. It is a legacy of kindness, beautifully built from the ashes of human greed. I hand the documents back to Martin, who nods in quiet admiration before returning to his car. I am left alone again, staring out over the garden Diana planted so long ago. I think about the chaotic journey of the last 6 months, the betrayal, the meticulous investigation, and the clinical execution of justice. I didn't ask for this war, but I fought it with every ounce of my experience. They thought my silence was weakness, never realizing that a silent calculator is simply adding up the cost of one's ruin. Family isn't about blood, it is about respect. And at 71, my life isn't over. It's just been properly audited.